Hello, Gary.
Hello, Martin. Good to be with you.
Yes, well, that's certainly a song of welcome right there from Midnight Oil and the boys in terms of some of that. So it's great to welcome you to Gadigal Land here in Sydney. Whereabout are you?
I'm on Wurundjeri land in Melbourne, so the suburb of Essendon, just northwest of the city centre.
That's wonderful. Well, look, it's great to have you with us, and particularly in this week, in NAIDOC week, it's great to welcome you as part of our gathering here tonight. And we've got a good number of people who've come and joined us on what is a cold and wet night here in Sydney. But let's begin just with talking about yourself a little bit. Tell me about your background.
So I grew up in Lutruwita, which is our name for Tasmania. And, I grew up in a rural part of the state. Most of the state is pretty rural. So I just grew up in a little small town on the north coast there, and went to the local district high school, one of just two or three Aboriginal families in the district. And went off to university, trained to be a teacher. Um, my mum came from good sort of Cornish Baptist stock. My dad came from Aboriginal people, Tralloway, that's my mob. So there was this mixed background as I was growing up, and therefore a lot of conversation between, if you like, the sort of Christian Baptist upbringing of my mum and the Aboriginal spirituality of the land from my dad. And so that conversation was always happening in our household and in my head and in my heart. And I guess I've continued on with that in many ways.
Okay, so tell us a little bit of how that conversation goes. I mean, what would be the elements of the conversation?
Well, I guess for Aboriginal people in Australia, everyone tells the story a little bit differently depending on where people are from. But for us, the centre of our lives is not a being that's up in the sky, or a being that's even come to earth in the form of someone like Jesus, for example. But it is country. It is the land beneath our feet, the rivers, the waterways, the sky, the stars. All of these things are our family, our relatives, our kin, because we believe that the world was created by creator beings, by ancestors who were sort of like hybrid human-animal sort of characters, a bit like the Nephilim that you find in Genesis chapter 8. And, the country was formed by those creator beings. And when they'd finished their work, they sort of lay down and slept in the landscape. And so depending on where you are on the continent, we believe that our ancestors are sort of embedded into the landscape, and we're descended from them, and we're related to all the animals in that area and all of the plants. And so our kin is not just our human brothers and sisters. Our kin includes flora, fauna, and the landscape itself. And so we have this very strong sense that country is what makes us who we are and gives us what we need in order to sustain ourselves. Now, I find it very interesting as a sort of a Christian as well, that the way we talk about country in Aboriginal Australia is exactly the way that Christians talk about Jesus. So Christians say Jesus is the one who gives us our life. Jesus is the one who sustains our life. Jesus is the one who sacrifices himself in order that we may live. Jesus is the one who feeds us with good food and gives us the sustenance that we need for the journey. Jesus is the one who gives us the good law, love one another, and as I have loved you. So all of these things that we say of Jesus in the Christian tradition, we have been saying in the Aboriginal tradition of country for 130,000 years at least in this country. So I'm very interested in that sort of that analogy between the God who is revealed in Jesus and, if you like, the divine that is revealed in country, in Aboriginal spirituality, and the conversation between those.
Okay. I mean, for some people, though, that conversation would be an exclusive conversation. I mean, in the sense of saying that the one doesn't connect with the other. The one is an older version, and then you've got Jesus coming as the revelation itself. How do you respond to them?
Look, I know that talking this way can be very uncomfortable for some people on both sides of the conversation. I know that some Christians, particularly those who, I suppose, come out of a more sort of fundamentalist theological framework, are very nervous about attributing any divine characteristics to anyone apart from Jesus. I understand that. I just don't see it that way myself. The way I read the Bible, there's an awful lot of intercultural and interreligious dialogue right there in the pages of the Bible. And the kind of exclusivity which says Jesus is divine and everything else is not. I don't actually see that in the Bible. On the other hand, on the other side of the conversation, many of our old people are very, very nervous about Christianity because, you know, the church was deeply embedded with the state in doing all the damage that was done to us over the last 200 years or so. And so for them, talk about Jesus is just white man philosophy, and we don't need to listen to that at all. But I guess I'm one of those who sort of sits in the middle there somewhere and says, we don't need to conclude that one excludes the other. It's quite possible for us to have a conversation and notice the analogies without having to do that sort of modernist enlightenment trick of saying that everything has to be explained through this particular set of glasses. I'm quite comfortable with the idea that we put on different sets of glasses and we see different things because of the way in which glasses refract the light in different manners. So I leave it at that, and I can say that in a much more complicated way, in European ways, in you know, involving post-structuralism and postmodernism and all that sort of stuff. And you know, I have written a book about that. But in the end, I think for me, it's really just an ongoing conversation, and noticing the analogies between the two is all we need to do, without necessarily concluding that one has to be absorbed into the other in order for it to be true.
So for us, I mean, I'm obviously my great accent is not a good Aussie accent. So I come from somewhere else, and so I'm one of the new ones to arrive on these shores. And so for me, obviously, my sense of spirituality comes from where I was born, and so there's a spirituality reality in terms of South Africa. But then, of course, I also have a tribal reality in the sense that my surname is Levine, so I come of the tribe of Levi, or at least I understand myself that way. And so I got a sense of that tribal reality in terms of where my spirituality comes from. If you had to say what some of the highlights, the main aspects of Aboriginal spirituality for you, what would those be?
Well, for us, Aboriginal, I mean, of course, the word spirituality is a European word. So in European thought, spirituality tends to be spoken of as a kind of special experience alongside a whole bunch of more ordinary experiences, you know. Aboriginal people don't divide the world up that way. So for us, spirituality is just a way of life. It just means a way of life. And the best way of life from our point of view is a way of life which is connected to the ground. So I would call it a kind of dirt spirituality. It's a spirituality which is very much to do with knowing where you are and how the environment in which you live works and how it sustains itself, and trying to align yourself with the way that place works. So it's very much about, you know, for Aboriginal people, having lived where we have for 130,000 odd years, we've picked up a few things about how things work where we are. And it was really only in the last 200 years, with the disruption of colonization and people being forcibly removed from country and all of those sorts of things, that we started to lose that knowledge. But in the meantime, we're very much on about learning where we are and working in sync or in harmony with everything that is going on in terms of the natural environmental cycles and systems of where we are. So it's all about being in tune with your environment, being in tune with country, and living according to its law. That's really everything that is important for us.
So, for me, I love what you're saying, because I think that same spirituality is evident in the Old Testament, or the Tanakh. I mean, the Jewish people didn't divide people up into bits. That's a Greek thing. It was very much a Jewish perspective of saying that we one person connected to the world, which is why the Bible is all about land, because of course that's the connection in it. And of course land isn't just a particular land, but the land in the sense of being landed, of grounded in terms of who we are. So I like that. I think the spirituality is very compatible between those. The ancient religions have got lots of compatibilities in terms of that. You were saying though that one of the things that's happened, of course, for Aboriginal people is the coming of the colonizers, who then pull people off the land, or put their land and their connections. Is the damage that's been done through that, is it reversible? Is it can we do something about that?
I think we can. We can do some things, but there are a lot of things where the damage is just too great, and we're not going to be able to go back. I mean, one of the things that's unique about what happened here in Australia is that when the newcomers arrived, unlike in many other places like India, for example, they didn't go away again, So in India, the British came along, they did a lot of damage, but then at some point they went away again, Similarly in Malaysia, similarly in parts of Southeast Asia. But but where the British went, they stayed, So, and because the British became overwhelmingly the dominant culture and the dominant way of doing law and doing politics and doing economics and all that sort of stuff, we're never going to be able to get back to where we were. It's just not possible, and anyone who thinks that they can is running a little fantasy. So what we need to do is we need to talk together, the people who are now in this country, for good or ill. We need to talk together about recovering some of what Aboriginal wisdom might be able to contribute to actually saving country, saving the environment, so that we all have a better future. Because really what our land management techniques were all about was sustaining the land so that the land can sustain us, not just for this generation or the generation after us or the generation after that, but for thousands of generations into the future. So the trouble with the colonial mindset is it tends to think in terms of, well, how much money can we make out of this country in a very short space of time? Doesn't really think much about future generations. And so the amount of damage that's been done is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. Australia has the fastest rate of extinction in the world, and has had that sort of number one spot for the last 30 years. And our rivers are drying up. We have massive problems with water resources. Our soils have been compacted by years of running sheep and cattle, so that the soil is becoming salinated and won't grow stuff anymore. We have catastrophic bushfires now, so that some parts of the earth that have been burnt will never actually produce anything ever again because the fires were so hot. you know. And so all of those Aboriginal land management techniques that actually helped us to live in harmony with this country for 130,000 years were just kind of swept away by the colonists and regarded as primitive, stupid stuff. And the colonial mindset was, well, we know how to do things. We have a superior set of techniques. We'll apply those. But actually, we're discovering now that those techniques did vast damage. And so, you know, thankfully, a lot of scientists are actually starting to listen to Indigenous people about a whole range of land management and water management wisdom, and are starting to recommend to governments and those sorts of things that that we radically change the way we do things. But all that stuff takes a long time to kind of work its way through the system. And I think we're talking about generational, incremental stuff rather than anything that's going to happen overnight. So it's a long journey, and I'm hoping that we get started on it before we get to the point of no return.
I want to look more about that, and we'll look at a bit more about that after the break. But I want to just work through your journey a little bit more as well, because not only did you have the conversation between your mum and your dad's kind of perspectives, but you then actually became a priest in the Anglican Church. So you really took a central position in terms of some of this reality. What moved you to become a priest?
Well, I only became an Anglican priest about 5 years ago, but you may be interested to know that I was a Uniting Church minister for 18 years before that.
Yes, I did know that. Yes.
Yeah. So some would see that as sort of the fact that I grew up Baptist, was ordained as a Uniting Church minister in 1995. And then became an Anglican priest. Some people would see that as kind of ecclesiastically promiscuous or something like that. But from my point of view, it's just kind of ecumenically adventurous, you know. So, and I guess my experience across a range of churches has been that that the things that you need to have a church are the same for all churches. You know, what you need is baptism. In which people are immersed into the life of God and given new life. What you need is the Eucharist, or Holy Communion, by which Jesus feeds us, you know, with his very self. What we need is the Word of God read and preached, so that we hear God's law, which is actually a law of grace. And you know, all churches have these things. We need the people in our bodies themselves, because we are the body of God. We are the body of Christ, and so all churches have these things. They just put slightly different emphases on. You know, in some churches this is a little bit more important than that, and in another church this is the more important thing. You know, and I often, because I used to teach liturgy to Uniting Church candidates and Anglican candidates in Melbourne. One of the exercises we used to do quite often is to go into different churches from different traditions and notice what the building itself tells us about what's important in that tradition, you know. So often, for example, we would go into a Presbyterian church where there'd be this pulpit that's sort of 9 feet above contradiction, right in the middle of the church, and a tiny little communion table off to the side somewhere, or hidden down here somewhere. And it was very, very clear that in this church, the word, and particularly the preached word, was central, you know, and so on. So there's all sorts of ways of doing that. But for me, you know, one of the things that's common to all churches is a priesthood or a pastorate or an eldership, depending on your tradition, or a ministry. And every church needs someone who is put aside and given the responsibility of looking after the spiritual well-being of a community. And, you know, all the churches in different ways or other have someone who acts in that kind of care of souls, primary teacher of the word, primary president at the Eucharist and at baptism. But really it's a kind of cure of souls role. It's about sort of looking after the spiritual health of the community. And every church needs that. And so even though I felt the call when I was a young guy, and I worked steadily towards that over a number of years, and actually ended up getting ordained in the Uniting Church, I don't really feel the fact that now I'm an Anglican priest is somehow discontinuous with that. Yeah. I just have a different boss, you know. So in the Uniting Church, my boss was a presbytery, a group of people. In the Anglican Church, it's a personal episcopate, so it's a bishop. I've got to say, I find having a boss that's one person a lot easier than having a boss that's a number of committees. But that's just me.
Yeah. I think you'll find that there's other uniting ministers who would feel the same way. Actually, that's.
Yes.
But I mean, I suppose it all depends on who that one person is. That makes the difference.
That's right. Yeah.
But yeah, no. Look, because I mean, obviously, your love of liturgy is something that fits really well within the tradition of the Anglican Church, and your ability within that obviously fits within that as well. Garry, you've written this book called Gondwana Theology. Of course, Gondwana being the landmass that Australia broke away from to become Australia, or at least this southern continent here. It's a small book, and it's obviously collected from a number of your previous writings and thoughts, and then also you've got a liturgy for the Eucharist, which you mentioned earlier, the importance of that. As I was reading through it, though, one of the things that I realized was that a lot of the things, even the words that I used, and you've mentioned it earlier in another word that I used in terms of spirituality, that some of the ways in which we use words can in themselves be colonial. And I suppose one of those words is that word reconciliation. I mean, I know a number of people that I've come across have said things like, well, we've had sorry day, we said sorry, can't we now just get on with it? And the reality of it is it's not just about getting on with it. And reconciliation is certainly about one of those words. And you mention it in the book that reconciliation is one of those words which is a colonial word, much more than one that an Aboriginal word as such. So how do you understand what reconciliation would look like in terms of Australia?
Well, it's a highly contested word in Aboriginal Australia. People often don't realise that. Precisely because it's a word that comes from Europe. It comes from Bible translators into English have used this word to translate other words from the New Testament, other Greek words and that kind of thing. So it is highly contested. In Aboriginal Australia, it's highly contested on two grounds, really. The first ground on which it's contested is just a linguistic ground. That is, we were never one people, and therefore there's never been a breach in an already existing harmonious relationship, and therefore reconciliation, which means getting two people back together again where there's been a breach of relationship, doesn't make any sense. We could probably talk about conciliation, getting people back together who've never actually had a decent relationship. That would make some sense, but reconciliation doesn't make sense in Australia. That's the first thing. The second ground on which a lot of Aboriginal people contest the notion of reconciliation is largely on the ground of the experience of being invited to into a sort of process of reconciliation, but it not really getting anywhere much in any practical terms. So, we still live in a country where there's no treaty, where there's been no recognition of the prior ownership of this country, and therefore some kind of attempt to get a more just settlement into place, which recognises that huge damage has been done to people, to land, to relationships, and so on. And so because none of those things have actually happened, many of us would argue that processes around reconciliation have failed. And therefore, it's too early to be talking about reconciliation. Now, I would argue from a Christian point of view also that biblically reconciliation is the last stage in a process. The first stage in the process is recognizing or confessing or acknowledging the truth of what has happened between the two parties or the two individuals, or between ourselves and God in the Christian tradition, obviously. So telling the truth about what has happened and stop kidding ourselves and just fess up and tell the truth. That's stage one. And the second stage is what I would call repentance or metanoia. It's a recognition that the truth doesn't put us in a very good light, but we want to stand in a better light, you know. So repentance, the way repentance worked in the ancient church, for example, is when you got baptized, you confessed that you had done wrong, and you spat towards the west where the sun sets, which sort of symbolized darkness and the wrong way of doing things. And you turned to the east where the sun rises, and you say, I turn from sin, I embrace Christ, you know. So repentance is turning around and heading in the other direction. So stop doing it this way, stop kidding yourself, stop doing the things that make for darkness and evil and bad relationships and all those sorts of things, and start doing things differently, and with an emphasis on doing, not just thinking or feeling, but doing. Okay, so that's the next step. And then in Anglican tradition, we would call that amendment of life. You know, amendment of life. You've got to start living differently. And then the last step is reconciliation. That is, you go to the person whom you've wronged, and you demonstrate that you're trying to live differently, and you ask them whether they're happy to work on that with you. And if they are, then you've actually formed a new relationship, which is happening on a different basis now, because you've stopped being the abuser, and you've recognized that you need to stop doing that, and you're asking to have a different kind of relationship with that person. And if they say yes, then that's the beginning of reconciliation. It's not the end of reconciliation. It's the beginning of reconciliation. And then, you know, all those steps have to be revisited again and again and again, because bad behavior gets embedded in our sort of physiological and psychological world. All those steps have to be kept revisited on the road of reconciliation moving forward. So that's a sort of a long journey, a long journey. And it can't just happen overnight. I remember many years ago, I was working in a small town in Tasmania as the local Uniting Church minister. And part of what we did in that town was we got all the churches together and we did a bit of truth telling, and we went over to the local Aboriginal corporation, most of whom I was related to, and we said sorry for the way that our churches had treated those people in days gone by. And then the next year, when I wanted to have another Sorry Day ceremony, the local Pentecostal minister came to me and said, just what people have said to you, Martin. Oh, look, we said sorry last year. Everything's good now, so we can just move on. And I said to him, well, look, how many of those people do you have a relationship with that we said sorry to last year? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, you know, you said sorry to these people, but do you now have a relationship with them, a trusting, respectful relationship with them? Have you spent any time with any of those people? Have you listened to their stories? Have you tried to get inside their experience and accompany them in any way, shape or form? Oh, not really. Okay. So he started to see my point. It's about getting to a point where you have an ongoing trusting relationship and you're working on stuff together. It's not saying sorry in a ceremony, which is unconnected to life. It's not cheap grace, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer would have said. It's costly grace, which has an ongoing relational, trusting, working on it together kind of dimension to it. So that's the way I would sort of describe it.
So for my average congregation, what can I encourage them to do? I mean, what can we do in terms of small things, even to begin that process?
Well, the first thing to do, I think, is to form some relationships with Aboriginal people and say, well, how do you do that? There aren't any Aboriginal people around here. That's just not true. If you look at the census data for where you are, you'll find that there's Aboriginal people all around you. The Gadigal are not from the past, they're all around you. The Eora are not from the past, they're all around you. You can look in your phone book or use this magical thing called the internet and find that there's a local Aboriginal corporation or Aboriginal controlled organisation near where you are. There might even be a land council. So the thing is to not make a song or dance and sort of ring them up and say, you know, say I'm going to bring a group along and we're going to have a wonderful time together. You just turn up to ordinary things that they do as part of their life in that place, the ordinary community events that they hold together. And you slowly over time, you get to know people and you find out what's important to them and what the big gaps in their perception of where they would like to be and where they are. And then you can, out of the experience of forming incrementally trusting relationships with people over the time, then you can figure out what to do, you know. So it's not all grand gestures. It's about just getting to know people, and you don't get to know people by inviting them into your space. You go to them and you hang out in their space and do what they're doing, you know, and get to know people in places and in spaces where they feel safe, you know. So this is what I say to everyone. And some of the things that have worked for me in the past as I've tried to be this kind of Moses figure between the two groups, sometimes I just get people together to talk about their own families, you know. So I get Anglo or other migrant groups to talk about, you know, their sense of where they come from, their own indigeneity, if you like, their own soil, their own country. And that's of great interest to a lot of people these days because of the whole ancestry thing, you know, who do you think you are? And then I get Aboriginal people on the other side of the table to do exactly the same. And what they find is they have a heck of a lot in common, you know, and that can become the basis of just very, very ordinary, trusting relationships that have joys and sorrows and laughter and pain, you know. So I find that the big ticket issues are much more easy to address if the relationships are there in these small, ordinary, you know, day by day, week by week kinds of ways.
Excellent. Garry, we need to pull this together and to say thank you to you. And as I want to say to everybody, if you're wanting to read more about what Garry's on about, it's nice, it's short, it's always the best kind of book is one that's that kind of size. But the issue with it is that Garry goes into some more depth, and in fact quick depth into these issues that are involved that we've been speaking about. And so thank you very much, Garry, for your time. I really appreciate you sharing with us, and in such an open and an accessible way for us. I think part of what you were saying about this book was to try and get rid of some of the jargon and just get to some of the basic stuff that's important. And I think maybe that's what we need to do in terms of our relationships generally, is get rid of some of the jargon, get rid of some of the political realities of it, and actually get back to just human beings talking to each other and sharing the wisdom and the understanding that they have with each other. I think that's a good place to start. So thank you for reminding us about that, and we see what we can do together. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Martin. I was very glad to be invited, and very glad to talk with you this evening.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. We're going to continue now as we continue the process through this in just a little reflection on what I've heard tonight. And for me, as somebody who identifies as Jewish, the concept of land or country is quite a big deal. But the reality of it is that when I think about that concept of land or country, for myself, my sons are the 6th generation in a different land, in a different country. Each of my ancestors have been in a different country. And so for me, in terms of the land, is part of what Garry was talking about. And that is the concept of actually the day-to-day connectedness with whatever's happening in our world. I think our world is so easy for us to become disconnected from the spirituality of country, from the spirituality of the ordinary, from the spirituality of that spirituality becomes something which is separate to our lives, and we kind of put it on as an overcoat, when in fact that spirituality should be something that's within, that binds everything together and binds us to the place where we are. And so for me, as somebody who's a newcomer to this land, I come though acknowledging that in fact God has come before, that God has been here, that God is active here, that God has revealed himself here, and that he's revealed himself in all the thousands of years before Christianity ever came here. And it's that connection with what is already that we need to connect with in terms of Christ. And so I see this as something that tells me those two things. One is to make a connection, is to grow roots into the space. But at the same time to acknowledge that in fact this land is much older than me, and so therefore I mustn't come with an arrogance or a sense of superiority, but rather with a sense of acknowledgement that in a partnership in spirituality, that God is already here. And so therefore I need to grow from the understanding that God has given to us.